How's it going, everyone? It's Noir Tapes back with another video. Recently I had a comment from this guy asking me to elaborate a bit more on the low passing I did in a previous video to get the bass for the song. I don't use this technique all that often. I find it much cleaner just to take one shots of bass samples or use a plugin to get the bass that I want to use in the song. But it is another way to be creative. Sometimes you hear a really strong bass note in a sample and you think, I wonder how I can use that. And when you filter it, it sometimes gets that classic hip hop feel. Because back in the day, that's what they used to do. Instead of having these fancy one-shots and plugins, they would just use a jazz sample and filter out all the highs just to get the bass. And so the bass sounds muddy and thick, and it's often boosted in volume after they process it. So it just sounds fat, right? So one of the best ways to achieve that old school hip hop sound is to use this method. So I made a little beat here, just a short one real quick, just used a few one shots. But the important part of what I've done here is the samples I picked for the melodic components also had strong bass elements below them. So when I started constructing the beat and I found a rhythm I liked, I could then split the sample into a high end and a low end. So the high end is obviously the melodic components, and then I took the low end and I filtered down and got rid of everything on top just to get the bass note, and then I thickened up the bass notes to make its own bass line. You can also duplicate the sound and take that bass note and add a loop to it to make it go forever if you want to do that. I just decided to play the one short note in a little pattern I liked and leave it at that. I wasn't going to do anything too crazy. The melodic components in this beat are already filling up a lot of the space anyways, so I just needed something to reinforce the kick essentially. So these are the two samples that make up the melodic component. You'll notice in this particular sample, there's also a very thick bass presence. That's important. That was the part I was listening for. I was listening for something catchy too, because I wanted to make a decent beat. But I knew to do this technique, I needed something with a decent bass presence to be able to single out that bass note as well. So let's have a listen to that one more time. Just try to listen to that bass note. You can really hear it at the start. You can hear a lot of the high end of the bass too. That's a really good indicator that there's a bass guitar playing. If you don't have a subwoofer, you won't be able to tell that the bass is necessarily below it. So I'm going to filter down and cut the sample short just to get that one particular bass note at the start. This is the bass note I was left with after I took a low pass filter and brought down the cutoff to eliminate all the high end of the sample. And I also brought the end of the sample back just to get that first bass note. And so then I added a bit of soft clipping just to make it louder. And I think I added a bit of distortion too. And then it's up to you if you want to resample that and then put it in a key grip program so you can use the scales. I like to just leave it in the program on a separate pad. And then I'll just use 16 levels and go to the tune section. And then I'll also move the original pad just a bit higher so I can get above and below. Now, one thing to note, if you're worried about length, as I mentioned previously, you can always make this its individual sound and turn on the loop function and just find a loop in the bass so it goes on forever. That's one way to deal with it. The other thing you might be concerned about is as you play a higher pitch note, it gets shorter, and a lower pitch note, it gets longer, right? And it kind of sounds weird at points. If you want to eliminate that, you just have to go into that pad and turn on the warp function and just set the length to how you like. I will warn you, it does sound a bit weird when you go up. You start to get artifacts, and when you start to get lower, it sounds a bit funny too. It's not super natural, but particularly if you do this before you filter the sound, when you filter the highs, it gets rid of a lot of those artifacts. So if you want to keep the bass sample the same length, definitely warp it before you put the low pass filter on. So what I did with the rest of the melodic content in the samples was actually used, I think it was the vocal filter that's in the MPC. But you could just use a high pass to get rid of the low end, and then you can create your own bass line below that. This is what I ended up with regardless. If you guys want me to do a video breaking down the filters that are in the MPC, I'll be happy to. I like to use a lot of the weird ones that are in some of the menus. A lot of people don't know about them, and I find them super handy. There's a filter in there for each individual situation. So, but anyways, so we have our melodic content. We have our bass note from the second sample that we can play in our own bass pattern. And then I just added drums and played around with the bass line and made a beat. So I'll play the whole beat for you now. I hope this video gives some more clarity on that technique. It's kind of an older technique and one that a lot of people talk about, but not a lot of people remember, and necessarily they forget it. It's always a good one to have in your back pocket, I think. You can be super creative with it and create some really unique bass tones that other people will never have access to. They'll never find that sample just from the bass note, you know? So it's a good way to be creative with what you've got. And sometimes it's just more efficient, honestly. Instead of reaching into your bag and trying to find a bass sample or just reaching for a plug-in and hoping that sounds good, you've already got a bass note that comes from the sample you're using, right? So it should, in theory, fit right in with the rest of the beat. As long as you don't go too crazy with the effects, of course, to boost up that bass signal. But in theory, it came from the original sample, so it should just fit in with the rest of the beat. It's just another way to be creative. I highly recommend you give it a go. It's a lot of fun. If you have any more questions, feel free to drop a comment. And let me know if you want me to break down those filter types in the MPC. If you're interested in that video, let me know. I'm sure I'll be able to teach you something that you've never heard of before. And as always, I'm trying to learn as well. So I'd love to dig through it and learn a bit more about everything anyways. Alright, anyways, thank you for watching. I'll see you later, y'all.